Okay, so we should probably reintroduce ourselves.
Yeah.
New episode. So I'm Caitlin.
And
We're gonna confuse you this time.
I'm Nicole, Esquire.
um, and
Okay.
that's not how science works.
Thanks for tuning in to our second episode.
Yeah, we're already messing with your heads. This is gonna be fun.
You were about to be killed for your crimes, but now you can turn into a cloud of gas. Okay, it seems like that could come to pass. DNA is very sublimate-y. You were a criminal and you stole a gun that can freeze to absolute zero. Hey, wow, that is really cold. And not a physical impossibility. That seems plausible to me. Plausible to...
Yeah, lol, no. Because...
That's not how science works. I can't think too much about it or it makes my head hurt. That's not how science works. I don't know who wrote this nonsense, but it wasn't researched. And we're gonna talk about it in this podcast. You should buckle down, my friends, for real science. And today we're gonna talk about 2 more episodes of The Flash. Spoiler, the science is still bad.
So, once again, if you haven't listened to our first episode, what Caitlin and I are doing is we are dissecting bad science in the media, and we are using the TV show The Flash as a case study because, man, there is bad science galore this show. I mean, I like this show, but I have to turn off my science brain when I watch it. So, I have a bachelor's degree and a master's degree in biomedical engineering. Caitlin?
I have a bachelor's degree in animal science with a heavy science emphasis because I was pre-veterinary at the time, and a master's in public health with a focus in policy. So I know way more than I should about, like, your animal critters.
And once again, a disclaimer that Caitlin and I are science nerds. We are science enthusiasts. We are not actually practicing scientists. So,
Yes.
and even if we were, we wouldn't be experts in all fields of science, quite obviously. And the show The Flash is just bad in all fields of science. So if there's something that we get wrong, please let us know, and we will run a correction. We've tried to do our research, and I think for this episode, we are less likely to get something wrong because the science is just so obviously bad.
It's just not science. Like, if you listen to our first episode, it was kind of long because they actually tried to connect to, like, real scientific phenomenon or real science that's happening. They just did it bad. But in these 2 episodes, they just made things up and pretended they were science.
Yeah, this is true. Caitlin, you did the first synopsis last time, so I will do the synopsis of episode 3. So basically, in episode 3, Barry is continuing to explore his powers, and there's this guy who they think at first who can control gas, and he's like killing people, and then they later find out that he was a convicted prisoner, and he was in the process of being executed by a gas chamber because apparently Central City still uses those. Great job, guys. And that was his situation when the particle accelerator exploded, and so somehow he became a gas man. So he is now a person, but he can also just turn into a cloud of hydrogen cyanide. That's green.
You know it's him because it's green.
Yeah, because hydrogen cyanide's obviously green. So he's going around killing people who participated in his conviction. So he kills, like, the crime family that he was working for, and he kills the judge who convicted him. And then he goes after Joe, who is Barry's essentially his stepfather. And Joe happens to be visiting Barry's biological father in prison at the time, so both of Barry's dads are in trouble, and Barry goes, and Joe almost dies, but Caitlin, who's a magical scientist, has come up with a cure for hydrogen cyanide, which is a really big discovery, by the way.
Why, thank you. Thank you, Nicole. I feel so smart.
Yeah, you are smart. So Barry gives Joe the cure, and then he chases the guy down the street, and then he basically tires the guy out because the guy just keeps following him, and Wells is like, he's gonna have to reform into non-gas shape at some point, and being in gas form is gonna wear him out because we know that gases are the least stable of all forms of matter, which, sure, Wells. I have thoughts about that. And so eventually he tires the guy out, and then in the meantime, Cisco and Dr. Wells have been turning the particle accelerator into prison cells to hold people, which they haven't had to do at this point because the bad guys in the first 2 episodes died. One was killed by Joe when he tried to kill Barry, and the other one killed himself. So they make like this cell with the super good force field from a magnet, and then they put him in the cell. And then the B plot in this episode is that Iris and Eddie are dating, but Eddie doesn't want to be sneaking around anymore, and Iris doesn't want to tell her dad because she's afraid her dad's going to be mad, but then she decides to tell her dad, and then Eddie's happy. Yeah. I think that's it.
Yeah, we are in general not going to really cover the B plots because a lot of times they have little to do with science and mostly to do with like relationships. But I just want to put out there that before I started watching the show, I thought I would be team Barry and Iris because I really like Iris as like a concept and they're like canon and stuff. But actually watching the show, I really support Iris and Eddie. I think they're great together. I think Barry has a lot of growing to do, and it a little bit frustrates me but that the show just like has excessive pining after Iris.
Yes. And honestly, I like Iris as a character, but to the extent that other characters go on about how great Iris is, I don't see it. Like, she's great. She's not my favorite character. Like, if the other characters talked about how great Cisco was all the time, I'd be fully about that because Cisco is amazing. But, like, Iris's talked up greatness does not match her actual greatness. And so it does bother me a little bit too that like Barry is like, Iris is the only girl for me, and it's like, no, she's just the girl you've had a crush on for a very long time.
Yeah, I do think Iris is great, but we don't necessarily see how she is great because we only see her with Barry, and that's what I think bothers me about this idea that Barry and Iris are like, she's the only girl for him, because I actually think she's the wrong girl for him.
Yeah, I do like their, pseudo sibling dynamic a lot. And yeah. I do love how supportive Iris is of Barry.
So the first thing I want to say is that like the first thing in the episode is that Barry and Iris apparently went to go see a zombie movie together, and Barry is like, well, on the scale of zombie movies, it's 3, but on the scale of regular movies, it's like an 8 or something. And like, I refute this idea that zombie movies are higher quality than like regular movies. And I just want that on the record. It doesn't.
Yeah, no, I'm with you.
So.
I'm with you all the way. I was confused about that too. But I will say, one of the few good science points in this episode is that Barry tells Iris a random anecdote about how there's a zombie fungus that takes over ants and then causes them to spread the fungus, and that is actually a real thing. So the one science thing they got right in this episode was a nice anecdote at the beginning of the show.
And that was the moment that made me really believe this writer's room is just sort of like skimming the internet and hearing science things. Because that's like something that's been like very widely like sort of talked about and publicized on the internet. And
right.
And it like all you have to do is read one article and you kind of get it right at the level that they presented it here. Whereas like the greater scientific concepts they're going with, they're just wrong. So I have 2 areas in this episode. One, there's this huge B plot about how they go into the particle accelerator and they flash back to like when the night of everything happening, and Caitlin talks about how her fiance Ronnie presumably died, although I happen to know for a fact that is not the case.
What?
one of the like 2 episodes I've seen from the future, like Ronnie is around as a metahuman.
What?
So it's possible they're on an alternate
What?
Earth at that point, or like a different timeline, which we'll talk about in future episodes. But yeah. But one of the things about it is they go into the particle accelerator, and my only comment about that is that really what particle accelerators look like on the inside? Because I feel like it's not.
Sure.
It's very shiny, it's big enough for humans, and when they show the flashbacks, they show, like, you can see the particles moving, and, like, no.
Yeah,
Like,
I don't disagree
no.
with you. And they're like shiny red particles.
Yeah. But most of, apart from Barry's dad being convicted in 52 minutes, blah, 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 most of what my notes are on this episode have to do with the idea of gas and poison and poisonous gas.
Yes. Oh my gosh, yes.
So I'm going to start with the thing that they got right, which is, yes, at some point in history, hydrogen cyanide was used in gas chambers that were used as part of death penalty executions.
Yes.
Yay! You got that right.
I looked it up, and apparently gas chambers are still a legal means of execution in 6 states. It's just nobody uses them. They all use lethal injection instead.
I don't know what you want to talk about first, like the idea of this gas or the idea of hydrogen cyanide and an antidote to hydrogen cyanide.
So I will start by saying that when they examined the first victims, Barry notes that they had histotopic apoxia, which that is actually correct. So that just means that basically, even though you're getting enough oxygen, your cells are unable to use it correctly. And that is, in fact, the way that cyanide kills you. Mm-hmm. So that was correct. And his conclusions also sort of made sense because he concluded that a metahuman was behind it because he talks about how they were all of the victims were clearly sitting at the same table, but then some of them were able to get far away from the table, and that wouldn't make sense if the gas had entered the room at the same time.
Oh yeah, that was actually really legit reasoning.
That actually made sense. So he tells Joe, I think it's a metahuman because it seemed to go after these people one at a time. It doesn't make sense that they wouldn't have all just died at the table if someone had pumped in gas. So it started out well.
Right. And the other thing that they mentioned that like could possibly only be around because of metahumans is he's like, I couldn't find any trace of what poison it was in like the actual like corpse samples that they took.
Right.
And there are some poisons that will not show up, but largely we have really well-established forensic medicine for detecting poison. And depending on what type of poison it is, we are better or worse at detecting it. Like arsenic is real easy to detect in the body after you die. But I would just, if like the idea, like how do we detect poison in bodies is a thing that interests you at all, I just want to put in a plug for an amazing book. It's called The Poisoner's Handbook. It has a long subtitle that I always forget that has something to do with Jazz Age New York. And it is also like an episode of American Experience if you just want to watch it, but the book is better. It is a like chapter by chapter look at different poisons and how like we developed techniques for detecting them in the 1920s. And it's really good. So if you just want to read more about poison and how it affects bodies and how we detect it and how we know which poison is which, like 100% would recommend.
Yeah, I've read part of it. It's really good. I
would not recommend this episode of The Flash for learning more about that.
It's not a very good episode.
Yeah.
It's not. Episode 4 with Captain Cold is much better because Leonard Snart is the greatest.
Yes. But yeah, so some of that is like actually really valid and interesting, and then we know that it's probably a metahuman because it's not acting normal. The part where it really starts to get wrong is when they're talking about how to sort of defend against it. So Barry gets attacked by the metahuman because Barry thinks that the metahuman is controlling gas. So he like follows the gas to try to find the metahuman. But then what he figures out is that the metahuman can become gas. And like, I don't even want to wrap my brain around how any of that works. So we're just going to like chalk that up to magic. Because the idea of him being able to like sublimate and then immediately turn back into a solid, I just can't.
the other thing that really irritates me too is that earlier in the episode they were confused because they didn't find traces of the gas in the victims, though they found traces of another person's DNA, which that makes no sense whatsoever. Like, you didn't find traces of the gas, but you found traces of another really? Like, how do you even put your DNA in a gas form, man? I don't know.
Oh, yeah.
There's a lot of things wrong with this episode. All right, continue, Caitlin.
Barry has this encounter with the villain, and Barry almost gets poisoned. And he ends up, like, getting back to the lab, and Caitlin and Cisco help him recover. Caitlin suddenly has, like, amazing ability to be a physician and to treat Barry, even though there's no evidence that she's practiced medicine in any way in any previous episodes. And I guess there's the evidence of her, like, treating him during his coma, so okay, whatever. But, there's a lot of, like, talk about how he was only saved because of his body's ability to, like, replicate the cells. And they, like, capture a sample of the gas from his lungs, and that's how they're able to identify it. But, like, all of this kind of just comes back to this idea of how hydrogen cyanide actually kills you. Something that you guys might be more familiar with is if you've ever heard about carbon monoxide poisoning. Because carbon monoxide poisoning and hydrogen cyanide work in the same way, which is that they basically bond with your red blood cells, which carry oxygen around your blood. I'm not sure. Does hydrogen cyanide bond with the red blood cells, or does it bond with your lungs themselves?
I don't know. I'll look this up while you're talking.
Anyway, carbon monoxide works by bonding with your red blood cells and making it so your red blood cells cannot carry oxygen because they're already bonded to the carbon monoxide, and it doesn't, like, fall off. So, like, then you can't function anymore because your body has no oxygen, and that's why you die. I think hydrogen cyanide might do something similar, but with the cells in your lungs that, like, transfer the oxygen to your blood.
Okay, apparently the toxicity is caused by the cyanide ion, which halts cellular respiration by acting as a non-competitive inhibitor for an enzyme in mitochondria.
Oh, it's non-competitive.
Yeah, it's a non-competitive inhibitor.
But basically, it makes it so your body can't, like, intake oxygen anymore in a place that's not really replaceable. And so basically you can't have an antidote to it. It's not like it's, like, an acute toxicity that you can, like, cancel out, especially because it's non-competitive. So you can't, like, come in with, like, extra oxygen, or maybe you could, I don't know, but it's very permanent.
I believe I read that, like, one way to treat it is by giving someone, like, 100% oxygen, which I presume if you have more oxygen going on, then the non-competitiveness probably becomes less of an issue.
Well, and I think maybe it's 100% oxygen to try to get to the cells that haven't been affected yet long enough for your body to, like, turn them over. And so actually it's moderately plausible that if Barry has this, like, really fast reactivating ability to regenerate, that he could regenerate really fast new cells.
Yeah, because presumably the cells would be killed by the lack of oxygen, but he could just regenerate those. It's fine.
Right. The problem comes where Caitlin, like, magically... I mean, like, I appreciate Caitlin because we share a name and she's clearly a genius, but she magically creates in, like, not very much time, like 2 hours?
Yeah.
Maybe? This antidote for hydrogen cyanide that is injectable.
And it's just a throwaway line, too. She's like, oh, and by the way, I created an antidote to the poison.
But only 1 dose.
Like, this is big, Caitlin. You just cured hydrogen cyanide.
Yeah. Talk about your once promising bioengineering career being back on track.
Yeah, seriously. Let's publish some papers about this, girl.
Yeah.
Also, I'd like to point out that in the first paragraph of the Wikipedia article on hydrogen cyanide, it points out that it is a colorless, extremely poisonous, and flammable liquid that boils slightly above room temperature. Colorless, not green.
Well, but remember, metahuman.
I know.
Metahuman.
Well, the other thing they mentioned, too, is that he's not just made of hydrogen cyanide. He's also made of the sedative that they gave him before he went into the gas chamber, which apparently he can also just vaporize.
Oh, yeah.
That's a thing.
So choosing hydrogen cyanide as the poison, I'm sure, was done because it was actually used in gas death chambers, both for death penalty and other ones. But it's not a really good poison to use because you can't have an antidote. But the other problem is, like, just the idea of using a gas. Like, some of the stuff they have is really bad. The interesting thing is hydrogen cyanide specifically was, like, briefly used in World War I back when we were using poisonous gases. And they stopped using it because it was too unpredictable, because it's a very light gas. It's not very dense. So instead of, like, being denser than air and going into all the foxholes and whatever, like, hydrogen cyanide would just sort of float around and they couldn't control it, so they, like, didn't use it. And I guess you could dismiss that by being like, he's a metahuman who literally is gas, so he can control it. But one of my big issues is this idea that he's, like, controlling gas because gas is so dispersed. And hydrogen cyanide gas particularly is just, like, not a good gas for controlling. All right, so now you have way more things to say about gas.
How Barry defeats the gas, like I've already said, he basically tires him out by, like, making the gas chase him. Which, again, Barry can run at least 700 miles per hour when he puts his mind to it. And he's been training at this point, so he probably can run 700 miles per hour consistently. And that somehow he is having trouble outrunning the gas. And I understand at the end of the episode, he's purposefully, like, letting the gas catch up to him because he's trying to make him chase him. But earlier in the episode, he also has trouble outrunning the gas. Again, Barry's speed is whatever the story needs to be. So if Barry needs to not outrun gas, that's his top speed.
Right.
If Barry needs to not outrun a man, that's his top speed.
But if Barry needs to reverse a tornado...
Exactly. That's his top speed. The next episode, he's up against some bees. That's his top speed, the speed of bees. The other thing that I find really annoying is that Wells goes, Barry, gases are the least stable form of matter. He will have to reform eventually, which that is not true. Like, noble freaking gases, Dr. Wells. One of the most stable...
You can't see this. You can't see this because you are a listener, but Nicole is having a miniature meltdown.
I don't even know what to say. I can't even. I can't even, Wells. I can't even. Like, basic chemistry, 7th grade. One of the most stable forms of matter is a noble gas, which doesn't bond with anything because it doesn't need to. And guess what? It's a gas. I can't even. Like, that's not even a little bit true. So that's great. Great job.
But that would require the writers of the show to know what stable means in a chemistry context. And clearly, when they hear stable, they're thinking, like, maybe dispersion or maybe...
Yeah.
I don't know. But clearly it's not actual chemical stability.
No. The other thing I have written in my notes is I have no idea about whether his particles will need to reform, but sure, okay. I'm sure it takes a lot of mental power to psychically control a green gas cloud. Like, there's just a lot of things in The Flash where I'm like, yeah, sure, okay, whatever. Like, if you've ever seen the Lego Movie, I'm gonna describe a soundbite for you. So if you've ever seen the Lego Movie, there's a part in there where Emmett is describing about how if he puts the piece de resistance on the Craggle, that they will win, and then Vitruvius is like, oh, and it will explode. And Emmett goes, wait, you didn't mention that. And Vitruvius is like, oh yeah, like there's a good chance it'll explode. And Emmett goes, but it might not explode. And Vitruvius just goes,
Sure. Let's go with that.
Yeah, sure. And, like, that is the soundbite that I just picture in my head all the time when I watch the show, like...
Sure. Let's go with that.
That is just, like, what plays in my head, like, yeah, sure.
It's so interesting because, like, clearly the writers were trying to do plausible things, but they just only did half of their research. And then they just made up the rest.
Yeah, and what was so frustrating is like it actually turned like the beginning scenes where they're analyzing the crime scene. I was like, wow, this actually sort of makes sense. And then it just was like,
yeah.
And then it blew up into a green gas cloud.
But all of this is not nearly as bad as episode 4, which we can summarize as absolute zero problems. Yeah, so this is going to be real short because I have very short notes. Basically, in the 4th episode, we get our first non-metahuman villain. What happens is they're continuing to sort of test Barry's powers. They're seeing if he can, like, multitask at speed by, like, testing him doing multiple things, which made me be like, wow, if he can multitask, he's a real hero. And then they are kind of testing out his ability to, like, move faster and regenerate faster and heal faster, which made me wonder if he's more cancer prone, if he's regenerating faster, and if it's just his cells regenerating more. And basically in this episode, there is a career criminal who's really smart and really good at what he does, and the Flash has been sort of practicing fighting crime, and the Flash comes and stops him, and he's like, oh, I knew that I had enough time before the cops could come get me, but then this thing came fast, so I need a way to, like, slow things down. So he goes to his, like, arms dealer, and his arms dealer is like, I have this gun that makes things freeze, and he's like, great, I'll buy it. And so he buys this gun. He's also, like, a real criminal because he, like, shoots people instead of letting...
No, he shoots the guy.
Yeah. Yeah. Right. He shoots the arms dealer, and he also shoots one of his crew that tries to leave. So he's, like, real bad.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. So the B plot in this episode is, there's this whole thing with Eddie because Joe is unhappy about Iris dating Eddie, and Iris thinks it's because he doesn't like Eddie, and Joe says, no, it's because Eddie's my partner, and now every time I have to put him in a dangerous situation, I'm going to think that I'm endangering your boyfriend. But then he gets over it because Eddie's awesome at the end, and he saves Joe from Leonard Snart, who is the bad guy in this episode. The other B plot is that Felicity from Arrow comes into town.
Oh my gosh, yes. Okay, sorry, I just deleted it from my mind.
Yeah, Caitlin.
It's so bad. It's so bad. So here's the thing, is I watched enough of Arrow to see the crossover when they were introducing the Flash and they had Barry in an episode of Arrow. And I really liked it. I thought he was cute. He had this flirtation with Felicity. And I thought it was cute because everybody, like, knows that Felicity loves Oliver. And Oliver's oblivious. And when Felicity has sparks with Barry, she might have a chance at something else. And also Oliver is suddenly like, wait a minute, Felicity is desirable and people might want to date her? So it, like, really works in the context of Arrow. But then here, Felicity is just like, oh yeah, that guy I had, like, a crush on and then he disappeared for 9 months and never talked to me. Like, I'm gonna go drop in on him and see how he's doing. Because I know he's alive because he was talking to Arrow, like, a week ago. I'm sorry, I, like, deleted this plot from my mind.
That's all right.
So she, like, pops in, and then Iris becomes very invested in, like, setting Barry up with Felicity. Even though, like, they live in completely different cities, they have completely different careers, and it would just be hard to, like, start a relationship in that situation. But they basically are, like, going on dates and...
Yeah, but what I like about it is how invested Iris is in Barry's happiness. Like,
yeah.
I don't love the whole thing with Felicity, but I love Barry and Iris in this episode because I think it's sweet. Like, it's clear that she just wants Barry to be happy.
Yes.
Which is awesome.
And she wants Barry to have the happiness that she has, but not in a way where she's, like, forcing something down his throat. Like, he clearly wants to be in a relationship. She just doesn't know that he only wants to be in a relationship with her.
Right.
So she's trying to, like, set him up with this girl who really seems like his type.
Right.
Yeah, so that's, like, a whole side plot, but it's very forgettable because it does not work very well in this setting. Because it's just bad.
Yeah, and it's not that important. Like, Felicity doesn't really play a huge part in this episode.
Yes.
She hacks into a satellite system at one point with her magical hacking powers, which...
Yeah. I will say that she does make a reference to having hacked the city's system before.
Yes, that's true.
And if she had done that and she left herself a back door, maybe she could hack it that fast. But if she had not, then no.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. I think my problem with Felicity, and I will bring it up here because I don't think we're ever going to talk about Arrow on this show.
No. Arrow, no science.
There's a little bit of science. So Felicity, I really liked her as a character at the beginning of Arrow. And then after a while, like, her hacking powers just became unbelievable. Like, she would hack into things that you would not be able to hack into because they would not be connected to the internet. Like, she hacks into pieces of construction equipment. I have no idea how, but she does. And, like, her hacking skills avert nuclear war, because that's a thing. And a combination of that with the fact that, like, Felicity after a while can do no wrong kind of makes me eye roll at Felicity now. And, like, even in this episode where Felicity, I still liked her at this point in Arrow, you know, she comes into town and everyone talks about how great she is. Even people who have not met her. Like, Wells has this whole speech about how he's like, I know you're a super smart person because I keep a list of all the super smart people in case I want to hire them someday. And it's just like, I don't think that you need to have characters tell us how great Felicity is. I think you should just have her be awesome.
Right. Well, and I think one of the things that was cool is when you see her in the first seasons of Arrow, she is really smart and she's very underutilized in her current role, and that's why she's able to, like, be convinced to do all this stuff with the Arrow. But, like, if she was really this amazing, promising star, and then she, like, got, like, a desk job at Queen Enterprises or whatever it's called.
Yeah.
Like, what? No.
Well, so they do sort of go into that in Arrow. Like, she almost went to federal prison, and so she was lying low at this point.
Ah. So basically, the sum of it is, Felicity is almost the entire B-plot, and it was forgettable, at best. I never finished summarizing, like, the gun.
Yeah.
So he's not a metahuman, but he has this sweet gun that can freeze things. And he uses it to freeze Barry, and Barry, like, I don't know, almost dies, ? But he recovers because magical ability to recover fast. And then he, of course, doesn't bother to, like, do any research or figure out anything about how to, like, defeat this freeze gun. He just gets mad and runs off and, like, tries to defeat the freeze guy. And the freeze guy has figured out that Barry, of course, cares about civilians, and he does not. So he puts him in a situation where he has to save civilians, and then the guy is able to sort of get in a position where he's able to freeze Barry again, and then, like, he is going to escape. Well, Cisco, aka Best Ever character, shows up with Caitlin, and they bluff their way into getting the freeze ray dude to leave without doing any further harm. And I think they also get him to turn the gun back in?
No, he keeps the gun.
Oh, he still has it? Okay.
He has the gun and the diamond, Caitlin. He successfully steals the diamond.
Right, so at the end of the episode, he has this completely unbelievable diamond and the freeze gun and a different weapon that he also got from the arms dealer that he killed that is like a flamethrower. And there's 2 teasers at the end of the episode. Again, Wells being evil or whatever. And then you see a teaser of this guy. I think Wells is evil at the end of this episode.
I think so. Oh, I remember what it is. So the other plot in this episode is that the reason that the arms dealer had this gun is he stole it from Star Labs, and the reason he was able to do this in the first place is that Cisco created this gun to stop Barry in case he ever became evil. And Wells gets...
Right. Which is actually...
No, yeah, I agree with you. Like, I was bothered by the fact that, like, everyone gets mad at Cisco about this because, like, seriously, people turn evil all the time in superhero shows. And, like, Cisco's point is, like, we didn't know you. We didn't know if you would be a good guy. But Wells gets, like, unreasonably mad about this. So that's the thing with Wells.
Of course. Yeah, because Wells has some plan for Barry.
Yes.
And then the little tease at the end is we see Mr. Freeze, Captain Freeze.
Captain Cold. He's my favorite villain, Caitlin.
Captain Cold. Very well played by Wentworth Miller III.
The only reason the character works is because he can play him well.
He has decided to recruit someone who previously was, like, too dangerous for him, and it's heavily implied that the person he recruits is a metahuman. So even though he's not a metahuman and his previous crew was not made up of metahumans, he's still around in the and at large, and he is recruiting, I presume, metahumans. You're shaking your head at me like that's not true.
Yeah, it's not a metahuman.
Oh,
He's
what?
not a metahuman, but it's
It would have been better.
it would so if you remember, the arms dealer talked about how he had like a hot gun and a cold gun.
Yes.
He gives the other guy the hot gun.
Right.
And the other guy, so if you don't know who Wentworth Miller III is, he's from the show Prison Break. And the actor who plays the guy that he recruits is the same actor who plays his brother in Prison Break.
Wow, that's well casted, man.
Yeah. But so I just want to talk about Captain Cold, which has nothing to do with science, but we probably don't have enough science to fill this episode anyway, so I'm just going to talk about this. Captain Cold is my favorite villain in this show because he's so ridiculous. I just love how every time Wentworth Miller's on screen, he just talks like this. You know, he talks really cold. And then later on, just as a teaser, his guy he recruits is a big hothead, and he always talks like this, like he's on the verge of exploding. And I love this so much, Caitlin, because it's so ridiculous.
It's very comic booky.
Oh, yeah. The other thing I love about Captain Cold is that his like bad guy costume is just a winter coat. All times of year, it's just black clothes, and then he wears a blue winter coat. And I love this so much because I just like, yeah, I mean, it works for your character, but like this idea that there's this guy in like a winter coat while it's like 90 degrees outside. I just love this so much. I love his character. It's ridiculous.
It's very ridiculous. I didn't really understand his motivation at all, but I don't know if that's really relevant.
Crime!
There's something I did not mention about how the cold gun works, which what we should say here is because when I described this episode, it sounded like it made perfect sense. He has this gun, it makes things cold, it freezes things, it freezes Barry. Because I didn't tell you that it's an absolute zero gun. Because if it's not an absolute zero gun, the whole episode makes a zillion times more sense. Like, yeah, making things colder makes them slower. Like, slower particles are colder. Cold and slow, like, yes, fast is the opposite of cold. That's why friction, when Barry is running really fast, makes his clothes smoke. Like, they had to be writers who wanted to be snappy and tie it into science, and they just pulled absolute zero out of a science word cloud with literally no idea how it works. So my notes for this episode are like, jokes about Barry multitasking and jokes about his friction shoes and like wondering whether Barry is more cancer prone because he's generating cells so fast. And then literally just absolute zero nonsense. Is what I said. And then there's no other notes. Like, that's it.
So the absolute zero thing comes up at least once a season, if not multiple times a season. And every single time, I'm just like, if you Googled absolute zero, one of the first things that comes up is absolute zero is physically impossible to reach. Yeah, it's just hard to say much about it because no.
Honestly, anything we can say would not be as good as you just Googling absolute zero and reading about how absolute zero doesn't work.
So the thing about absolute zero is it's not possible to go to because of the Heisenberg uncertainty principle, which has to do with velocity, but it in a little less, I guess like science term way, absolute zero is not possible to reach because everything, even very cold things, has at least a little bit of energy. And absolute zero means that it would have no energy at all.
And I think that's one of the things is, like, maybe in 300 years, if this podcast still exists, someone will come back and be like, LOL, absolute zero was not a problem. What are these guys talking about? Because sometimes I go back and I'll look at, like, scientific things we deeply believe to be true. And then now with current knowledge, we know that that's not true. But it would require such a paradigm shift from current knowledge and current scientific knowledge. And yes, there's always, like, research going on around absolute zero, but it's because it's like the foundational bedrock of a lot of what we know about physics.
Right.
And so people want to win Nobel Prizes, so they're doing research.
Right. The other thing is that you can get very close to absolute zero, for sure. And part of the reason we like doing research at very cold temperatures is that molecules behave differently when they're very cold. So there's a lot of interesting things that they do near absolute zero, but not absolute zero, because that's impossible.
Right. Well, and it's very interesting because, yeah, we can get close to absolute zero and do this cool research in a lab setting, and it's real hard.
Right.
Like,
right.
Basically, there's this concept that the short version of it is that the closer you get to absolute zero, the more energy it takes to get close to absolute zero.
Right. You're approaching like a limit, right? Like,
yes.
You can get close, but you'll never quite reach it.
So, yeah, just the idea of a portable absolute zero machine is like...
But the other hilarious thing about this gun is they talk about how it shoots cold flames, which... What is that? I don't know. I can't explain it to you because I don't know what that is.
Sure. Let's go with that.
You know, my brother and I, who's watched a lot of The Flash along with me, we decided that in order to have a universe where superheroes exist, they had to give up reliable laws of physics. And that's what's happening here.
Right. Well, one of the interesting things that I'm sure we'll get into as we keep watching is that The Flash actually deals with some things that are in the comics but don't always make it into like movies and TV shows, like alternate universes and alternate timelines. And so it's very true that in the world of The Flash, the idea that just like The Flash existing has changed the state of science. Like, that really could be true. And so maybe that's why Cisco can build an absolute zero gun. But it's, again, like how in the previous episode, if Caitlin just published her hydrogen cyanide antidote, like, man, that would be her Nobel Prize right there. Like,
yeah.
If Cisco published his absolute zero gun, portable absolute zero gun, like, it was just so much acclaim. And I love Cisco. I think he's great. He's probably a genius. But science takes a lot of smart people working for a long time to push the needle even a little bit.
Oh, yeah.
And
oh, yeah.
This show really does not understand that.
No, although that's not just this show. I mean, you know, like, one of the things that always bothers me about the Iron Man movies is that Tony Stark just, like, whips out science like it's nobody's business. And, like, if you have ever worked in a research lab, known anyone who worked in a research lab, you will know how endlessly frustrating it is, because for every small breakthrough you get, there's 10 more disappointments. There's 10 times that the experiment didn't work, or your programming is bugs in it and you don't know why. Like, it is really difficult to make advancements in research. And then you have Cisco, who, like, on his first try builds an absolute zero gun. Sure, Cisco.
Sure. Let's go with that.
Yeah. He did have 9 months, but...
Well, but he didn't know that Barry was fast. Because he specifically built the gun to stop Barry, right? He didn't build it in 9 months. He built it since the first episode. He built it in a few weeks.
That's right. I was thinking he knew the whole 9 months, but you're right, he didn't. Oh my gosh. So one of the things we haven't really talked about yet on this podcast, but I'm going to introduce now, is like, why do we care? Like, do we just like picking things apart? Yes, we do. But like, why do we care about bad science in media? And I think there's like two kinds of bad science in media. There's bad science in media that's silly and ridiculous, but that ultimately is relatively harmless. And then there's bad science in media that actually kind of causes harm. And I think sometimes they overlap. And here's what I'm going to say about this. I think this comes up over and over in media, this idea. There are two things. One, this idea of like a lone scientist or a small team that is like out there pushing the boundary and being the amazing genius, like Tony Stark, or this team where they have one specialist in like each area, and, you know, Cisco just building these amazing machines. And I think that really detracts from the real situation that like science requires a lot of people innovating many ways. And oftentimes, if there is a lone scientist who made a breakthrough, there's 3 or 4 other lone scientists who made the same breakthrough, because just the area of science has gotten us that far. Like, you'll see this sometime in like coding, and when like coders will all discover like the same flaw in a program at near similar times. It's because everybody is doing similar research, and people are connecting similar dots and they get to a similar place. The other problem with this kind of idea put forward about science here that, well, Cisco just wanted to create an absolute zero gun and then he did. It perpetuates this idea that if we just want it hard enough, we can make science do the thing we want. And if we just hire the right, brilliant, smart person, we can make science do the thing we want. And this is like really on my mind right now because I just read a book called Bad Blood, which is a book about the Theranos disaster. If you don't know what Theranos is, it was a Silicon Valley startup that was going to revolutionize blood testing. And it turned out that it ended up being this huge fraud and like lots of money was spent and wasted. People were actually like given really bad false results from it, and it all sort of crashed and burned. And the scientific community was kind of looking at this and being like, they're not doing science like science works. Like they're not sharing their results. They're not publishing in peer-reviewed papers. They're not consulting with other scientists in the field. And the company kept being like, trade secrets, and we are like a startup and we have to protect our intellectual property. And really what that, like listening to this book that talks about Theranos, the main person behind it, I don't know what she was thinking, but she sort of seemed to believe that if she just promised enough that her technology would work, that then it could work. And she didn't seem to understand that you can't just make science do what you want it to by sheer force of will. And I think like shows like this, when they have things like the Absolute Zero Gun or they have a character like Cisco, like we all know that he's fake, but it does kind of perpetuate this idea that if you just hire the right smart people, you can magically make these huge leaps forward. And it's not, I mean, there obviously are leaps forward that happen, but usually you don't have one person who's so far ahead of everyone else in the field, at least not in modern science.
Yeah.
So that's my soapbox. You can cut it out if you want to, Nicole.
No, I thought that was good. I definitely thought that it was good. I totally agree. And, you know, for the most part, I think that in the context of this show, it's probably not super harmful just because, like, maybe less so here, but some of the stuff that Cisco does later on, I feel like is so ridiculous that even if you don't have a science background or you've never met anyone who's worked in like a science or engineering lab, you could still be like, yeah, that seems pretty far-fetched. It's more when you look at it as a trend in media that I think it bothers me.
Right. The Flash is not single-handedly responsible for the fact that Theranos had this board of very smart, important people who didn't know anything about science and just believed what the CEO was telling them. But the Flash is indicative of a trend, which is to use science as magic. And there's like something that sci-fi writers will say, which is actually pretty clever, which is that any really advanced technology, if it's an advanced technology from the future and you don't understand how it works, it looks to you like magic. Like if we were to go back to 1900 and use credit cards or cell phones, it would look like magic. And that's true.
Right.
But this like recurring like narrative that we have around science and media is not great. It's exciting and it makes for great plots, but it doesn't make for real science.
Yeah. Well, you know, it's like my other pet peeve, besides shows that mess up science, is shows that mess up the law. And I think that one is similarly hurtful because it gives people false expectations for how legal cases work. You know, if you watch an episode of Law and Order and, you know, you're like, oh yeah, they got a ton of evidence and they put the guy in prison that week, and that's your main exposure to the legal system, and then an actual crime happens in your life and you don't understand why it's taking a year for the guy that, you know, burgled your house to go to trial. Like, I think it's similarly problematic. Like, if this is your main exposure to science, then it's problematic for you to think that, like, making these breakthroughs are easy. Just like if your main exposure to the law is Law and Order, it's problematic for you to think that that's how the legal system works when it really does not. Yeah. It's even more problematic if you've watched Suits, because that's really not how the legal system works even a little bit. But that's another podcast.
And stay tuned for a future episode when we talk about all the damage that the CSI franchise has done to the legal system.
Oh gosh. Oh gosh, yes. Oh gosh, yes. Yes. Well, even some of the stuff with Barry being a forensic scientist, like they will mention things like, did you do that fiber analysis? And there is a lot of forensic science that is not backed by actual science, and things like fiber analysis are one of them, because a lot of it just involves a guy in a lab or a girl in a lab comparing two different samples visually to see if they match, and there's no real scientific criteria to determine if they actually do match. A lot of it is down to the person's opinion, and they might be biased. They might just be like, yeah, I think this is our guy, so I'm going to say it's a match.
Yeah.
So Barry's part of the problem.
Yeah, absolutely. But yeah, so that's basically all the notes I had for episode 3 and 4 of The Flash.
Why, when there's like people running real fast and particles, why does liquid start floating? This happens in The Flash a lot. So this happens when in the first episode when Barry is thinking about the night his mom died. The liquid in his like fish tank starts floating, and then the night of the particle accelerator explosion, Wells' drink starts floating, and I don't understand why, and this is never explained. Can someone please tell me why magic particles cause liquid to float? I guess it's just the Speed Force.
Well, I was just gonna say it is Speed Force, and this is why. I was reading about Speed Force, and apparently part of what Speed Force does, because obviously if you're like traveling at very fast speeds, like the sort of the aerodynamic situation of you is different. Speed Force magically keeps Barry from like floating away from the ground, and it allows him to continue running really fast at high speeds. So clearly Speed Force is manipulating gravity. Therefore, whenever things are like floating, it's because the Speed Force is manipulating gravity.
Sure. Let's go with that.
Yeah, okay. I would like to say that in my notes, I started abbreviating the Speed Force as SF with the trademark symbol next to it. So, for example, I still don't get the floating liquid, probably the Speed Force trademark. I also have, there's another part in episode 4 when Felicity is asking the science team about, you know, what the implications are for Barry, and she's like, will Barry age prematurely because his cells are replicating so rapidly? And my note is, oh, Felicity, the Speed Force trademark will not let Barry age prematurely.
That was the moment where I was wondering, because they were like, we don't really know, and that was the moment where I was like, is he gonna get cancer, like a lot?
Yeah.
But the Speed Force will save him.
It's the Speed Force. The Speed Force is just, it's everything. It's just magic. It talks to Barry sometimes, gives him life advice.
Are you serious?
You laugh now, but it does. I don't think it does in this season, but it does in the next season. Speed Force gives Barry life advice about how he needs to move on from his mother's death. I'm psychologically preparing you for this now, because when that episode happens, it's so freaking weird that you're like, what is this?
Oh, man.
My brother prepared me for this episode, and I think it helped, and now I'm preparing you, Caitlin. There is an episode where the Speed Force tells Barry that he needs to get over his mother's death.
Well, I guess we have that to look forward to, but not for a while. Our next episode will probably cover the next couple episodes of The Flash, and then we're going to try to get a guest to come in and to do a different topic so that you guys don't get totally burnt out on us talking about the Speed Force.
Speed Force!
But again, as always, thank you for listening, Mom, Dad, brother.
My brothers and parents.
Siblings.
Friends
that we have coerced into listening. Or, you know, downloaded this and never listened to it. That's fine.
That's cool.
And strangers. We appreciate you.
We do.
Please let us know you're listening.
Yeah, you should add us and say nice things about how smart we are.
Yeah, you can find me on the internet under my full name at Caitlin Vanasse on Twitter. That's where I'm most active. We'll put that in the show notes because it's a kind of an unusual spelling. Or, you know, just you have to know how to spell it.
Because you took lots of French classes. Yeah. You can find me at Nicole Luckless, which is not my real name, but I don't want people to be able to Google me and find stuff.
Yeah, I just have no shame on the internet.
No, it's cool. Oh, I was gonna say you should also check out Caitlin's YouTube channel where she talks about books.
Yeah, if the 2 book recommendations I gave in this episode were not enough, you can check out my BookTube channel. There's a link to it in my Twitter bio, or you can just do youtube.com/bookchats, all one word, CHATS, plural. And then the last thing I will say is that if you see examples of bad science in media, or you just think that you're not sure whether or not it's bad science and you're too lazy to research it yourself, send it our way.
Yeah. We will research it for you, and we will watch the bad science.
Sometimes.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, hey, I roped you, Caitlin, into watching The Flash for this podcast.
I was just, the whole time, what did I get myself into, man?
So thanks for listening.
Thanks for listening.
We will catch you next time. Bye.
Bye.